Good evening and welcome to the VCUarts Faculty Lecture Series. I'm Cynthia Donnell, Associate Professor of Voice in the Department of Music here at VCU in the School of the Arts. It is my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, my colleague, Susanna Klein. At the end of the lecture, there will be a Q&A section, so kindly submit your questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Susanna Klein is a violinist and professor of violin. She is also a tech entrepreneur, a practice researcher, and author of the acclaimed Practizma practice journal. She serves as head of strings in the Department of Music, School of the Arts, right here at VCU, her alma mater. This is where she geeks out by researching data-driven practice and the psychology of practice. Professor Klein writes and presents nationally on empowered practice and technology in practice. Her research has been supported by the Center for Teaching Excellence and the VCU Presidential Research Quest Grant. She wants music to catch up with sports in terms of both tools and culture, and she dreams of developing wearable feedback mechanisms for musical practice. As a violinist, her resume includes appointments with the Memphis Symphony, the Richmond Symphony, and the Colorado Orchestra. She still likes to practice, now more than ever. Without further ado, I present Susanna Klein.
Thank you, Cindy. Thank you so much for that introduction. Thank you, everybody who's here. Thank you for people joining us online as well. And I want to start off by thanking VCUarts for inviting me and the ICA for hosting in this very beautiful space. And I'd also like to start by thanking my colleagues and students and friends for all their support through many of my Practizma shenanigans, as I like to call them. I'm so honored to be here today talking to you about my journey as a violinist and my story as a researcher of musicians. Monday through Fridays, I'm an associate professor of violin for the music department, and on the weekends, I run a tiny little startup company called Practizma. Practizma makes tools for practicing musicians, and tonight's talk is about the story of Practizma and how it came to be. First, let's look at what the word Practizma means. And by the way, of course, I completely made it up. It doesn't actually exist, but I would like it to exist. I want Practizma to be something that we strive for and something we achieve as musicians. So here is the definition. Practizma, a feeling of efficiency, empowerment, and joy associated with practicing music. 2, a healthy state of being, both physically and psychologically, for practicing musicians. So Practizma is the nirvana that I would like to see in the musical world. And it's the concept that I aspire to when I train musicians right here at VCU. I'd like to back way up in the story of Practizma and first tell you a little bit about myself. I grew up in Germany. My mom is American and my dad is German. This is mostly irrelevant, but I always start all my talks with this little bit of information just so that you'll forgive me when I fumble with words or I start slipping into a German accent, which has happened when speaking in public and being nervous. The one way that my German background does fit into the picture is that I used to be a very serious teacher. You know, serious, unforgiving, high standards, uptight. These are all things we associate with Germans, and for good reason. I moved to the United States when I was 13, and I landed in Baltimore. And this next bit is relevant to the topic at hand. When I was in high school, I was both on the track team and the swim team. The swim team was the #1 team in Baltimore City, and it was very competitive. We took it very seriously. In both track and swimming, I was deeply influenced by my coaches. My swim coach, Miss Cross, in particular, had a huge impact on me. One of the things that she made us do is that everybody had to swim all strokes in practice. So I was a backstroker in competition. That's all I ever raced. But in practice, we had to do everything. And when I say everything, that included butterfly, which for me was a kind of near drowning experience because I really couldn't do the stroke at all. And so early on my freshman year, I just said, Ms. Cross, I can't fly, so, can I just do freestyle instead? And she said, darling, you are way too young to say I can't. It may not be easy and you may not be good at it, but you have many days to practice it before we get to I can't as a phrase. So please add the word yet, I can't yet, and now get back in the pool and show me some fly. She did some really inventive things in practice that took me decades to really understand what she was doing. One of those was that she had us swim with pantyhose on during practice. Slightly uncomfortable, I should say, but we would cut off pantyhose, we would cut off the feet at the bottom so we wouldn't slip, we would put on the pantyhose, then put the suit over top of it, and then practice. And what that does in the pool is it makes you incredibly waterlogged. It gives you the feeling of heavy, your muscles actually have to work harder, and then for the races, for the meets, she would have us take the pantyhose off, and not only were we faster when we did that, and had been training harder, but we felt faster. And that feeling of coming out of the block with such speed and feeling like you're just gliding through the water was an amazing thing. Another thing that she did that I think I've only come to understand now, really as an adult and as a teacher, is that when we would race against teams that were, just really weak, there's no other way to say it, teams that potentially we could have blown out of the water, with a score 100-0, she made everyone switch strokes for that competition. And that made the score, 42 to, let's say, 25 or something like that. So she was looking out for the psychological well-being, not just of her own team, but of other teams that were competing against us. So I loved Coach Cross, and I loved the culture of sports. I really like how quantifiable athletics are. For example, you can know that your racing time today is exactly 0.01 seconds better than it was yesterday. And it's never that quantifiable in music. I also loved research and medicine in particular when I was in Baltimore. During my senior year of high school, I spent half of my days in the anesthesiology department of the University of Maryland Hospital. That's where I worked as an intern in the operating supply rooms. I got to watch open heart surgery pretty much whenever I wanted to, Monday through Friday mornings. I was fascinated by the human body, and I marveled at its resilience. The only reason that I decided at the 11th hour to study music instead of medicine was that I had a transformative experience during a symphony rehearsal. It was the summer before my senior year, and it was almost like I became infected with the music virus. I felt like music chose me, and that was it. I just had to do it. But I was a late bloomer, musically speaking at least, and not all that advanced. I had to practice many hours. As a freshman at VCU, I arrived at the practice room at 8 a.m., usually, and I left only for classes, to eat, and when I just couldn't stand it anymore. I practiced quite literally until my bottom lip would turn numb and I lost the feeling in it. I practiced until I couldn't turn my head in either direction because my neck was so stiff from holding the instrument. I practiced desperately all through undergrad and grad school until I got a job, and then I practiced desperately to get another job, and again, another job, but I was still desperate. Here's how I describe the feeling in the introduction of my book, which I'm going to tell you about in a second. I say, I am a violinist by trade. On more than one occasion, I've been told how lucky I am to be a musician. So why then have I often felt despair along my musical journey? Even after successful auditions and gainful employment in the industry, I've often felt disheartened. Deep down, I have never felt that I was quite good enough. It seems that I'm continually searching for the Holy Grail. When I talk to other musicians, whether recreational enthusiasts, students, or professionals, they describe a similar feeling, regardless of their achievements. The gap between how we want to play and how we sound right now can be demoralizing. I call it the reality dream gap, and it is a necessary part of any musician's journey. Our ears, and therefore our aspirations, are always one step ahead of our abilities. It is exactly this gap that propels us forward and calls us to practice. The reality dream gap can be painful, but it is absolutely necessary. And then I go on to say this. Years of university teaching have allowed me to see this dilemma more objectively and less through the lens of my own experience. So many of us tend to focus on the bookends of the musical process, the goals on one end and our accomplishments on the other end. In between lie the daily habits that help us develop as artists, yet we rarely spend time valuing those habits or the journey itself for that matter. This misplaced focus will not make us better musicians, and worse yet, it can create a toxic pattern of insecurity and self-loathing. While we can all agree that progress is paramount, it can't be the only thing. Feeling good about our journey is important. It's not an afterthought, a byproduct, or a bonus. Joy fuels artistic growth and sustains us as human beings. So my obsession with practice started when I was a student, but my obsession with finding better ways to practice started in 2011, 3 years after I started teaching at VCU full-time. That's when the VCU basketball team had their dazzling Cinderella run to the Final Four in March Madness. I followed the team, but it's the coach, Shaka Smart, that really did it for me. Why was I so smitten with his coaching? It wasn't about his famous havoc defense maneuvers, although those were impressive. It was more basic than that. I loved his emphasis on psychology. He minored in psychology in college, and he used what he learned all the time. I loved his extensive use of video in the coaching arena, and above all, I loved his positive spin on everything. Day by day, minute by minute, he was deliberately and carefully instilling a growth mindset in his players. His coaching style was almost entirely relationship-based. It was personal, it was vulnerable, and it was real. Under the influence of what I like to call the Tao of Shaka, my own high school sports experiences came flooding back to me, but I started thinking of coaching not in the sports arena, but in music. You see, violin playing and sports have much in common. Both are highly dependent on excellent form and technique. Are you listening, students? Both basketball and violin playing are highly visual. You can see what is happening, and when you see what is happening as a teacher, you can explain why the sound is not wielding to our will. But that's just the technical stuff. For both athletic and musical performance, the following is true. The body achieves what the brain believes. Musicians and athletes practice ad nauseum, and then, despite our best intentions, things sometimes go awry on stage. Failure is often only in our mind. Unlike sports, there is no scoreboard, right? Audiences generally delight in our playing, even when we're not proud of it. We are our own worst critic. In sports, you call it a choke when you can't execute under pressure. We just say, I sounded bad. When a choke happens several games in a row, coaches will call that a slump. We just say, I'm a bad musician. The yips, which we have in both sports and music, is a little bit something different. That's when our muscle seize up on stage or on the court, and we lose control over something that's actually not very difficult usually. One big difference between music and sports is that athletes do have sports psychologists, and in music, we're not that evolved yet, or maybe we're not that honest with ourselves yet. While following Shaka's coaching, I started thinking, why don't we do some of these things? And so the following year, I dedicated myself to exactly that project. I applied for a teaching grant through VCU's Center for Teaching and Learning Excellence, or CTLE for short. So CTLE is VCU's unit that supports faculty development and innovative teaching, and they had a small grant program for new approaches in existing courses. My grant centered on violin lessons, which is at the core of all music majors who are violinists. The title of my project was called It's All in the Game, What Music Can Learn from Sports. The grant supplied me with a modest but important funding mechanism. It allowed me to buy teaching tools and research equipment. Here's what I spent the money on. I bought a bunch of sports psychology books and workbooks, and I buried myself in them and did a lot of reading and a lot of research. I bought giant mirrors, which we installed in the music building. I wanted to mimic what dancers had in their studios. And here are some pictures of the day we installed them, and the kids were trying them out, and they were pretty happy. We also bought a handful of iPads, I think it was first or second generation, that we could use for video work with students, and they could, most importantly, use the iPads with each other. Above all, the grant gave me a framework for exploring how we could adopt athletic coaching models to music training. I was, in the beginning at least, very focused on excellence and mastery. My central questions were, how could we get better? More quickly, more efficiently? How could students see themselves more objectively, notice their flaws independently, without teachers having to talk about so many details? How could students drive themselves to work harder and smarter? I started by creating a kind of team structure in the violin studio with team captains. In the violin studio, we even had a mascot, the dragonfly. Now, I know that VCU already has a mascot, but I felt like I needed an additional mascot. And that's because dragonflies symbolize transformation, opportunity, vision, and spiritual growth. Rams, the VCU mascot, it's also good, symbolizes boldness, new beginnings, new paths, and power. So I feel like they go well together, but they're not, the same. We needed two of them. That year, I asked many times, what if? And then I would just try out some crazy stuff. I bought a heart monitor that students could wear on a sleeve in class, hooked them up to the iPad, and to be able to show the class what happens when we get nervous, how the heart rate rises, and how, if we coach our own breath, we can bring that same heart rate down so it's not sky high. I got a Fitbit, that was my own personal purchase, of course, and I can't say that it did a lot for my exercise habit, but I did use it to monitor my sleep. And what I noticed, strangely, was that every time I went out with friends, I slept deeper, longer, and with less interruptions. I thought that was very strange, but it turns out that that's a thing. So I went and read up about that. And apparently, when you are socially connected, in person, not online, like actually with pheromones, it makes you sleep deeper. The leading theory is that when we are alone, we need to be more vigilant sleepers, wake more easily, in case there's a predator nearby. The biggest breakthrough occurred when I asked students to journal about their practice process every single week. You see, journaling is what elite athletes do, especially solo athletes. I designed their journals based on all the reading that I had done, and these workbooks had space for musicians to track their practice activities and do some goal setting every single week. And the workbooks had weekly prompts. So journal prompts asked them to reflect, some journal prompts asked them to reflect, and other prompts asked them to do something, to get out of their comfort zone. Because we learn by doing, right? Not just by thinking. Here are some examples. A reflection prompt might read, describe in detail your earliest memory as a musician. An action prompt might be, play what I call the copycat game. Listen to 3 recordings of your piece, 3 different days of the week. After you listen, imitate the style of what you hear as best you can. Really exaggerate and do it as a growth experience, even if you don't agree with the stylistic choices of the performer. I started creating all sorts of prompts. What I was trying to do, sneakily, was to develop certain dispositions in the players. I wanted to beef up these qualities in them. Creativity, to be able to problem solve in different ways, to make practice interesting for themselves, to express themselves emotionally. I was interested in beefing up resilience, the ability to recover from failure quickly, or to choose to take on more risk in the first place. Optimism, to dream big, believe in themselves, and to be able to beat back the inner critic, which is always lurking. Discipline, to show up regularly, and to focus our work on the most important stuff, not the little fluffy things, like answering email in my case. Organization. Being able to scaffold our time well over the long term is important. And of course, keeping track of our stuff and organizing our space. These are the 5 qualities that I believe we must hone as musicians, but I feel like they're nearly impossible to teach, but it turns out that these qualities can be encouraged through careful curation. My studio of budding violinists blossomed, and I was thrilled. I became a much better teacher, coach, as I learned more about them. What struck me was not how quickly the students learned, but how their spirits waxed and waned depending on what I was asking them to do. Let me give you some examples. Early on, I might have an action prompt like this in the workbook. It would say, video record your entire private lesson with me, then go home and rewatch the lesson. Take notes and turn them in. They hated it. It was too much, it was too boring, and essentially, I was forcing students to relive an hour when they were being endlessly nitpicked and criticized. That is what a private lesson is, essentially, right? Later, I took the same prompt and I changed it to read like this. In practice, video record a short phrase. After watching it, practice improvements and record the same phrase again. Watch the second recording, practice a little bit more, and make one last short video of the same short passage. In the revision, the assignment was short. It was less threatening, it was autonomous, and most importantly, they could see their gains. They could experience a win. I became an anthropologist of sorts. I wanted to know what made musicians tick, what challenged them in just the right way, what connected them to their art, and what types of activities could inspire them to push through obstacles. I noticed that spirits lifted whenever I encouraged any of the following elements. Teamwork, partnering up, whether it's in pairs of 2, 3, 4, anything to get them working together. Elements of play, any kind of gamified setting, playful setting. Getting them, their origins, getting them back in touch with why they fell in love with music in the first place. And it wasn't to spend hours in a practice room. Refraction. Anytime they worked with a refracted image of themselves, they could work more patiently in a focused way. So I should explain, I got this term from a friend. A refracted image is one where we're not experiencing a completely real version of ourselves, right? So it could be an avatar. Often for us, it was in the motion capture lab at VCU, or it could be something similar, like watching a video, like watching a video, but not listening to the sound. That's a refraction. It's not completely the way it was. Oops. Okay. Here's an example of gamifying. This is really simple, but I just used it last week, so it was on my mind. This is now how I do midterms, where I call scales out for students. I put all the scales in a spinner app, and then I just spin the wheel. And A flat major is a nice sound. You can also customize these kinds of apps and make sounds like wah, 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 if it's a really hard scale. That just didn't come up this time. In addition to journaling in the studio, we experimented with technology. Here, I want to show you some pictures from that time, okay? We went to the motion capture lab on Broad Street, had a fabulous time. Here, I'm working with a student on posture, basically, being upright. And you're seeing, the actual view of ourselves plus how we saw ourselves, which was just little stick figures. These are 2 students geared up. I like to say ready for battle, but that's not really true. They were just practicing. In the motion capture lab, we have 2 suits, so not everybody can suit up, but the rest of the class would watch and have a good time. Here's a student getting fitted. And again, just more smiles than usually there are in my classrooms. Here I'm working with a student kind of shadow playing. Often we will do this in front of the mirror, where I will play and a student will kind of imitate me, but here we did it in motion capture, so we saw ourselves again in this refracted way. And we did lots of app work. I still use many sports apps today and life apps. This is amazing, all sorts of things that you can do. We also experimented with virtual reality. There was a virtual reality class that we got to join to see, and again, we're just kind of messing around. What can we pick up? So I created a film from my own viewpoint as a violinist, and then students would essentially inhabit that world, and they would really be seeing me, but they felt like they were seeing themselves. And apparently, they said it changed the way they perceived the left hand. So students often worked in pairs or small groups. And again, what I was stumbling onto as a teacher had little to do with music. I was learning about human nature and what drives us. To any psychologists out there, none of my discoveries will come as any surprise, because psychology of habits is fairly well studied, but it was all new to me. Here is what we know from the research literature about nudging people into building great habits, even when the pursuits we're interested in are difficult. Anytime we can introduce mindfulness, it allows us to have more grace with ourselves. Gamifying makes difficult tasks more lighthearted, more surprising, less daunting. Gamifying also gets us around what I like to call the other F word, failure. We're a lot less afraid of failing in a gamified setting. And when we are less afraid of failing, magical and transformative things can happen. Stretching out of the comfort zone in increments leads to the best results. So not too hard, not too easy, just right. Making gains visible is really important. It tilts us towards the positive. It makes us optimistic. And optimism is key, again, for making magic happen and getting out of our own way. Community makes a huge difference. Cultivating and curing it purposefully is really important. When I was on the swim team, we always sang on the bus. And I just thought it was this silly thing that we did. I really didn't understand it. So there's a song that I still will sing at home. I don't know if you guys know this, The Littlest Worm. The littlest worm I ever saw was stuck inside my soda straw. Cindy Donnell, who's a voice teacher, is cringing right now, and I understand that. But I just wanted to show you that, like, all these years later, this is like one of my favorite songs, and it's because I sang it with my fellow teammates together. And now, as a researcher, I know what singing does. It releases these pleasurable things, these chemicals in your brain. It takes the attention away from a threat that you may be experiencing, like being nervous for a race, and it bonds you to the people that you're singing with. So all of that is community. I'd never thought about a fundamental problem we had in music school until that time period. You see, many musicians love music precisely because it's through music that they connected to other people in a profound way. But music school means lots and lots of practice, lots of alone time. Most of our study time, what we call study time, is really a solo endeavor. We spend countless hours trying to get incrementally better, and we do it alone. And we often become trapped in our own story. It's isolating, and that can cause depression. And depression makes us tense, and that's a problem for our sound production. And it also robs us of our willpower and our resilience, which is so important in music because there's lots of failure, and you don't play the way you want to, and then you have to get right back up and do it again. So add to that we as teachers are constantly confronting students with critique, and you can see why the population of musicians might benefit from a little positive psychology. The longer I ran my experiments, the less I became interested in mastery and excellence. It was all about the psychology of the learner, their emotional relationship with practice. If you can still instill motivation and inspiration, mastery and excellence are the next natural outcome. You don't have to work very hard for that then. I continued creating journals from scratch every semester from then on. I usually will have violinists in my studio for 8 semesters in a row, so I had to constantly be creating fresh material. But I wanted to go deeper into the technology part because I could tell that really resonated with students. In 2018, I applied for and received a VCU Presidential Quest Grant. That is some very significant funding, and the purpose of the grant was to see if technology could help string players at various universities regulate their practice habits in a positive way. The study was called VCoach, V for violin or V for victory. That's still undecided. One of the reasons I had a successful grant application, I think, is a distressing reality. 88% of string players suffer overuse injury in their lifetime, meaning they will miss work and not be able to play precisely because they have been playing too much. And it starts in school. That's where pain starts setting in. My argument was that we need to work smarter, but we need to practice less. And we need to think of ourselves as artist athletes. For the study, we designed an app and we distributed rented iPads to all of our subjects. Players were instructed that whenever they're practicing, they should have the app open. We kept track of when and how long they practiced, what their practice patterns were. The app asked students to set intentions for every practice. Essentially, we were asking them to be goal-oriented and to cultivate mindfulness. Here's a screenshot, I think it's of the home screen when they opened the app. We had asked participants at the beginning of the 5-week trial to set intentions for the time period that they're working with the app. So I want to get better at ... I want to cultivate the habit of, that's how they're working. And I want to stop ... because most people can make some transformative progress in all areas of their life if they spend a little time also figuring out what to stop and not just what to add. At the end of every practice session, they were asked to rate how closely they stuck to their goals. We incorporated a tuner that allows us to see how well we are on pitch, a metronome, which goes tick-tock, tick-tock for you non-musicians, and a recording functionality within the app. Whenever students used any of the tools, we know that they were being used, and we tracked for how long. And they knew as well because they could see it in their own stats board. So they had a stats board on the app where they could see how many sessions have I done with tuner, how many sessions have I done with metronome, et cetera, et cetera. One of the things we were interested in was interrupting the pain from practice cycle. So this next screenshot is of a pain reporting tool we had in the app. Basically, the way this worked is at the end of each session, when they were leaving the app, we said, did you experience any pain today? And if they said yes, this is the screen that it would go to next, and they just had to tap on the body part of the little stick figure so that we could keep track of where were people experiencing pain. We correlated to what instrument they were playing. This was all string players, but different kind of string players. And it allowed us on our end to see when does that pain set in. And what we realized is that at 75 minutes, once you hit 75 minutes, more than 50% of the string players were experiencing pain. The tipping point was really about an hour in. So we wanted to know that for our research, but we also wanted participants to know that. And 100% of all our participants told us that this pain monitor, just being asked the question and being able to track it, made them more aware. The purpose of the study was to study self-regulation of practice. But once again, what I came away with was the emotional well-being, or lack thereof, of the musicians who participated. We launched several surveys with our subjects. We asked questions about the experience of the app, of course, and questions about their state of mind. Again, I saw lots of depression, what I would describe as crippling self-doubt, and lack of compassion with themselves. It was then that I became determined to stop studying musicians and actually start helping musicians. I wanted to do something. Around the same time, a friend suggested that I publish the journal, or a definitive version of all these journals that I'd been doing. He had been borrowing some of my journals for his own college violin studio with great success. He said that there was nothing else like it on the market, an interactive workbook designed to make practice more efficient and joyous, and he convinced me. So I spent the summer of 2019 sifting through 8 years of journal prompts. I had to decide what I should include, what prompts were no good. I had lots of help from colleagues, my family, thanks, Mom, and from current and former students, all pitched in to help me make decisions mostly. I wanted the book to speak to all musicians, not just string players. I had to consider the sequence of prompts and how many weeks there should be. I laid out the entire book in Canva. It's an online software program that I think many of you will know. And I hired Heidi Recken, the amazing Heidi Recken, to help me with design. Heidi is a VCU music grad, a trumpet player, who was an intern in the department, and she now works as a communications specialist at VCU Student Affairs. She's incredibly creative and imaginative and an amazing partner. And above all, she knew what practice was all about, and she knew what I was trying to do. And here are some pictures of how it turned out. So most of the book is blank space because you're supposed to write in it. It's a 16-week journey, and it's not easy. I found out after I published, I was like, let me do the whole thing in sequence. I had done all the prompts at some point in my life, but I'd never done them in sequence, and I was like, wow, this is really hard. I did a hard thing, but it's very, very satisfying. So I self-published in November of 2019, and in case you're wondering why I self-published, it's mostly because it didn't occur to me to approach a publisher. I didn't really have the nerve for that. And it turns out I should have been a little bit more confident because the book started doing pretty well right off the bat. And a few months after I published, the pandemic hit. So musicians all over the world had their concerts canceled. And without deadlines, musicians are adrift, confused, and unmotivated. That's kind of normal. So they needed structure, and I had just published the journal that could help. And because many musicians were less busy than usual, they also became socially more connected online, and that helped spread the word about the book as well. So that was all a little bit of good luck. And the next part was pretty much all hustle and hard work and doing daring things for me. I called independent music stores and sent them free copies. I picked up some wholesale clients, which helped then also spread the word about the book. I started reaching out to musician podcasts and organizations and received some guest invitations. I started writing articles in magazines and started talking about the practice of practice, the heartache of practice, the burnout, the shame, the crippling self-doubt. But I also talked about the science of habit building through psychology, technology in practice, motivation, inspiration, gamifying, and of course, I did also talk some about mastery. In 2021, I finally had the opportunity to keep developing the app that I had showed you earlier that we used for research. I knew from the subjects that had enrolled in the study that it was really useful, but it was also really complex. I made it way too complicated. And up until the pandemic, finding a freelance developer was nearly impossible. And finding funding, like some money to pay for a developer, was completely impossible. So the pandemic was for me, like so many people, a difficult time, both as a musician and especially as a teacher. But besides the timing of the book, there was one more silver lining in COVID-19, and that was that I finally did find a coder to work with me on my app. A musician friend of mine, jazz bassist Randall Farr, had gone to coding boot camp right before the pandemic. I knew Randall because he was the only other person in my undergrad years at VCU who practiced at 8 a.m. like I did. And Randall plays a lot of gigs with my husband, John, who's also a jazz musician. And because John was sitting on the couch most of the pandemic, every evening, instead of gigging, I knew that Randall was as well. I contacted him about the project, and he was willing to take a leap, and he had the time to do it, which he would have never had if we'd been in regular universe. I became the designer. Again, I used Canva almost exclusively to do mock-ups because I'm not really a designer. That's the only way I could do it. Randall and I learned together, not just about what we were doing, but also about how to communicate and be a team. We took one small functionality of vCoach that I showed you earlier and built a standalone app around that we called Clipsa. Here are some screenshots from the iOS App Store. Clipsa really only does one thing. It's very simple. And it is designed to solve only one problem, which is to make recording yourself easier. We know that musicians who record themselves in practice get better quickly. Recording allows us to become our own real-time coach. When we record ourselves, we hear things that we didn't hear and didn't see when we were actually playing. The problem with recording is not that we don't believe in it, we do. But we still hate to do it. The problem is not that it's technologically difficult. We have smartphones. The hurdle is purely psychological. We hate to be confronted with our own limitations. We simply can't stomach it. It drains us of our empowerment, our willpower, our optimism. Half the time that I record something, I don't even listen back because I know it's bad, I don't want to hear it. So Randall and I wanted to solve that confidence and recording problem, and we wanted to make it easier without so many questions like start button, stop button, play button, save. If you don't want to save, are you sure you want to delete? This action cannot be undone. We wanted to get rid of all of that. So here's how Calypso works. It's essentially a time delay capture app. You open the camera, you let it run, practice, practice, practice. And when you want to check out what you just did, you just swipe left on the screen. And it instantly plays back the last 30 seconds. Or you can tap the screen once, and it'll save the last 30 seconds in your files, and you can check it out later. Essentially, the camera is always rolling, and there's no start button. You just interact when you're ready to hear something or see something. The default clip length, that's how we got to Calypso. The default clip length is 15 seconds, 30 seconds, 60 seconds, or 90 seconds. The idea came from podcast apps. You know how you can, when you're listening to a podcast app and you miss something, you can just hit one button and it like reverses 30 seconds. That's where the idea came from. And we launched in 2021, and we're excited to just help performers of all kinds hone their craft. Actors, public speakers, dancers, athletes, and of course, musicians. So that's where Practizma is right now. And you know, what's next? I don't know, but I've got a couple crazy ideas as usual. I have a couple irons in the fire. My long-term dream is really to develop technology for string players that would really help us understand what our bodies are doing in space. And I would love for us to have some smart equipment. I'd like a gadget to tell me exactly how fast my bow is moving, or let me know when my bow is going crooked. Maybe something like that. Or when my posture is messed up. Maybe something like that. I'd love to be an avatar instead of my real self. That would make it more fun for me. So I'm currently in the planning phase on a project with Professor Tamer Nadim in the School of Engineering here at VCU, and we want to see if we can develop some technology and have some real game changers in the future. We're looking at questions of what can we render in real time that's meaningful to string players. There are mini IMU sensors available that can track a lot of movement and can show it, and sports has demonstrated such a wide array of biofeedback that it's like, there has to be something that we can do. So that's our kind of next thing, is to look at that. And I'd love just music to catch up with sports in terms of technology. There's only one mantra that I would like to never adopt from sports, and that is the no pain, no gain. And I think even sports is changing their tune on that one. So before we move into Q&A, I want to thank you, my students, who make all this informal research possible every day. And I'd like to thank Stephen Alcorn for these beautiful pictures you see. These are just from a couple weeks ago when he asked if his class could join my class virtually, and they could be doing some drawing of our class. And little did he know that he was, again, allowing my students to see themselves in refraction and feel that lift of, oh yeah, I did that. There's one last thing that I want to mention about Practizma, and that's something personal, what it has meant to me. In talking to others about these topics, I've been able to talk a bit to myself. When I admit in interviews how much shame I've often felt, it turns out I was doing a little therapy. When I tell students to take a couple days off and forget about it all and to give themselves a break, I'm listening to that message as well. Practizma has challenged me to rework my own complex relationship with my instrument. The best thing about Practizma is that it's making a difference in musicians' mental health. And the second best thing about Practizma is that it's been helping me. Teaching really is the ultimate cathartic experience. I'm so grateful to be at VCU, working across disciplines with professors and students who are open, curious, and who love to ask, what if? With each generation of students, I learn anew about what it means to be an artist, and above all, what it means to be human. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. And I thought it was only fitting, because I talked about students so much tonight, that we should have a student help with the Q&A. And so I'd like to introduce, come on down, Naeem. Naeem Gmati, sophomore, right? Sophomore music education student. I'm so happy you're helping me. Thank
Hello.
you.
Thank you.
And audience, if you have questions, live or online, we'll take them. We'll play a little, I don't know, Charlie Rose or something.
All right, so we have our first question here, and
You can take your mask off if you want, only if you want.
I'm cool with
Okay.
mask on, yeah. So Charles Jones says, I attended VCU from 1988 to 92, and always remember eating at Hibbs. It was the athletes' table, the artists' table, theater table, and not much did students ever mix. You bridged the tables in a way. In the reverse, as a musician who draws out draws out of the box from swimming, what do you see or should see sports potentially learning from music?
That's a really good one. Sports learning from music. I do think there's a way of using your body in an expressive way that can make sports more natural. I mean, I'm sort of going by, in running, I used to run hurdles, and you're supposed to count steps, and that's important so that you hit it at a right time. But I think if you can think of your body as a kind of expressive vehicle, you can kind of get into shapes that way too. I don't know. I mean, both disciplines, we spend a lot of money on equipment, a lot of money on coaching. I think we coach a lot more one-on-one, probably. And you get probably the most bang for your buck if you get some one-on-one coaching. Yeah, I don't know. I'd have to think about that. That's a really good question. I would just love for the two disciplines to work together, and then kind of they'll figure out what can we learn from each other. Yeah.
So I actually have a question myself that I wanted to ask you. And I was wondering, because you talked about how the idea about Practizma kind of came to you after 2011 when VCU kind of made it to the semifinals. And I was wondering, how was teaching before, in those 3 years before, as you were a VCU professor, how was teaching in terms of the goals you try to set for your students, how was that like? And what were the main differences you saw in the students afterwards?
You mean, so my particular teaching style in the studio? Well, I grew up in a scenario where, your teacher said, do this, and then if you didn't do that or you didn't do it enough, they kind of made you feel bad about the fact that you weren't doing it enough. And I wouldn't say that I used a lot of manipulating with the students, but I think I thought that wasn't my responsibility, to make it joyous, to make it fun. I think I just thought, well, you're in college, you're a music major. I mean, this is what you want to do. We're here to work. And I think, it's not that I was rude or anything like that. I just think I wasn't thinking actively about how could I make this more gamified, or how can I connect students together, right? I was focused on excellence and mastery, and I would just kind of dish it out, almost okay, here are the potatoes on the plate. Hey, this is how you play. This is how you do your right arm. The joy of it, I sort of left up to the students. Well, go inspire yourself, listen to a concert or something. So I think that's the main change. And it became a lot more fun for me to teach.
It makes the process better for both of you.
It's good for everybody.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, there's a question from the audience. Love it.
Hello. This is cool. I have two questions. So the first one, I can take this off 1 sec. First question is, you do a lot of working, whether it's through the Department of Music, through Practizma, or even elsewhere. How do you juggle doing all that and also managing your personal life outside of music? Sorry, tough one.
Yeah, no, I love it. It's a loaded question. It's mostly by lowering my expectations of myself, you know. I don't know if you noticed, so this is my student, Anna, who was in a class yesterday. I don't know if you noticed, like, me demonstrating in masterclass yesterday. It was like I couldn't play 2 correct notes in a row. Okay, you see, again, I'm my own worst critic, but, you know, if I'm really knee-deep in research, or even just preparing for this talk, figuring out what I was gonna say, like, I'm not practicing at all. I do feel bad about that. I do wish I could practice in those scenarios, you know. I do get a little embarrassed demonstrating in public when I don't sound good, but I also have just come to accept it, you know, and remind myself that my swim coach, Miss Cross, didn't get in the pool, and she was still a great coach. So I try to kind of organize my life in bunches, like November, December, January was kind of my recital clump. You know what I mean? And then there's more teaching, and then so I sort of take turns with a lot of activities. And I work every weekend. I love to work. I'm a workaholic, so that part's no problem. Like I get a lot of energy from it. But you do have to lower your expectations of, you know, I'm a little bit worse of a mom than I'd like to be. I'm a little bit worse of a teacher than I'd like to be sometimes, and I'm a little bit, you know, worse of a player. Like, but mostly I try to follow this mantra that you really can do it all, but not at the same time. So I kind of take turns. I hope that helps.
Yes, that is so helpful. Thank you. And then I had a second question, which is going forward with Practizma and everything, what are some things, I guess, for yourself that you're hoping to keep working on, like as far as personal development goes? I know we're working on like psychology and resilience and like accepting who we are and what we're doing as musicians. Is there anything that like applies to you specifically as a professor that also is related to Practizma? If that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I have to keep showing grace to myself. That's one thing. And then something I've been thinking about recently is I need to keep in mind when I'm teaching that there are entire generations of students that haven't experienced something that I've done before. And I need to kind of work on that structure of building it in. Like you as a student, it's partly because of the pandemic, but you have not been to the motion capture lab, for example. You haven't done virtual reality, right? And these are things I need to find ways of including things in each generation of students so that at least one time we're going to take a field trip, at least one time we're going to do this, at least one time we're going to do that. It's hard to get into the spaces because I'm relying on other people, but that's something I really want to do, and to kind of instill that sense of play and anything is possible in each generation of students, not just like on the particular day that I'm feeling it.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That was great. So we have another question in the chat, and this is a really interesting one. I read it ahead. So when it comes to a musician on stage, do Practizma's anthropometric observations also extend to the artist's visual stage performance and what a concert goer finds more interesting to watch? So I think to sum up the question in a way, it's almost asking, do your ideas and like things with Practizma not only come like with like movements and stuff for like the optimal sound, but does it also like take into account how it looks on stage and what type of show you're putting on for the...
No, I mean, it's really about the practice process. Really, it's really a lot of what Practizma is about your own relationship as a musician, whatever level you're at, to make practice more efficient, so you get better more quickly, because then you'll be happier, but also just to cultivate mindfulness to be happier in the first place. What I do believe is that when we like each other more and we're more accepting and we go out on stage, I do think that audiences can feel that and can, you know, I can't prove that, of course, but you know, all the cues that we have when somebody likes us, right? Or like, let's say when somebody doesn't like us or is afraid, they will back up, right? They have a certain demeanor. And I think we carry all that in our performances. So when we feel like an audience is threatening, and maybe we haven't accepted, hey, it's Friday, this is how I play. I've worked hard, it's not gonna be perfect, but I'm really proud of myself. I feel like the openness that we bring to it, I think an audience can probably pick up on, even if they don't know what it is. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Wow, it's great questions.
We have another one actually, and this one says, have you ever received any backlash or pushback within your field from people who think the way that like you were taught or your generation was taught should still be the norm?
Not about this in particular. I mean, you know, there are tougher and less tough teachers. I have had some conversations with teachers where I've had to say, like, wait, why? I remember one time talking to somebody about a left-handed violinist. And we have a left-handed violinist in the studio. For those of you who don't know, we play this way, and so a left-handed violinist will restring and play the other way. And I remember talking to somebody in New York at some point, and they were like, well, but that's just not acceptable. And, you know, that will always be against them, and they will have to prove themselves so much harder. And like, and I was like, but there's absolutely no issue here. Like, you can play this way, or you can play this way. Like, why is this tradition? Why are we protecting this tradition? You know, when okay, I'm going to throw a couple industries under the bus, but when you take higher education and classical music and you put those together, you're taking like some of the most archaic, you know, restrictive, tradition-bound institutions, right? So that's already spelling danger right there. So I do think we have to, and this is my personal opinion, I do think we have to constantly be innovating and looking for new ways, because it's not embedded in the industry, particularly in the classical music side. So it's not blowback that bothers me. It is sometimes just like, well, this is the way we've always done it. You know what I mean? Where I'm like, well, let's find new ways. We won't know what we will like until we just accidentally try it. Yeah. You know?
Looks like we have one more question in the chat, and it says, I got some of my dental work done in VCU School of Dentistry. The senior observing dentists were always reminding the dentistry students to raise the patient to them, not bend their back, in a soon-to-be painful position as well. What has Practizma revealed in terms of student musicians, and what are they doing physically? And what actually is causing them pain and making their playing inefficient?
Yeah, so dentists, that's like, I spoke at the School of Dentistry one time, and I thought it was about the app. I thought it was about like habits. That's why they wanted to talk to me, but it was really about the physical issues, actually. You know, what Practizma is really interested in is, you know, as a company, is making tools and making people aware. In the end, it does take, you know, it takes experts of saying, you know, posture is important. Do you know what I mean? And not ignoring things. The wearables that I'm kind of interested in doing, and quantifiable, so we can have some smart stuff, I think could really contribute to that if we ever got it off the ground. It's kind of a big project. But I think we need to not accept pain. I think we need to not be silent about it. You know, my generation was like, when you got tendinitis, that was kind of like, I finally got it, you know? Like, I finally practiced enough to get tendinitis. We were proud of it. Then, of course, 6 months later, when you can't play, you're not proud of it anymore. Then you get right over it. But it is accepted that you must practice so much that you're going to be in pain. And pain is the body's warning signal to stop doing something or doing it that way. So, you know, I think sports is coming around to this. Now that they have all those wearables where they can tell once somebody spends a certain amount of time on the football field, they're more likely to get injured, you know, and I'm hoping we'll be right on the tails of that. We must stop accepting pain. I mean, you know, I was joking earlier about my lips falling asleep. You know, I have what's called military neck. My neck has reversed the curve entirely, you know, and it's from playing, you know. I'm not sure if it was necessary, but I only played professionally full-time 10 years. It's not like I had 30 years in the system, 10. So.
So it looks like we don't have any more questions left, but I'd like to end on this one message I see in chat. And it says, wow, thanks so much for this, Dr. Susanna. After all those years in college crying alone in practice rooms, this speaks to me.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, everybody.